Hello, Patrick.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Miguel, I'm gonna be chairing your session today.
Okay.
By the way, is it gonna be just you in the end?
No,
Or-
no, no. There are two of us. My colleague Achim Schilling will join us in a few seconds,
Okay, yeah, no worries.
and we will both give the talk. So I will start, and after approximately 15 to 20 minutes, I will hand over to my colleague Achim.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Nice. Okay, let's wait a bit for Carl to join as well. Is it gonna be each of you have a different bit of the presentation then?
Yeah, well, yeah. So it's basically the same presentation, but first I will do screen sharing, and then Achim will share his screen.
Okay,
Yes,
nice.
otherwise, we have to click further for the other guy, so this is a little bit annoying. And
Yeah, yeah, no, that's good. Good. Where are you based, by the way?
in Germany, I'm in based at the University of Erlangen, so it's near Nuremberg.
Okay.
And Achim is based at the medical faculty Mannheim, which is part of the University of Heidelberg.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay, seems like he has problems to join the meeting.
Oh, let me see. Maybe he has sent an email or something. Let me check that.
Okay. Okay, he just texts me that the host has to admit his.
Uh, yeah, I don't see him. Can you tell him to join again? Just in case I can
Oh,
see
it's
the.
yeah. I I write him.
Okay.
So for some reasons, he has a Teams meeting link. So I will resend
Oh, yeah.
the Zoom link to him.
Yeah, okay, I see what happened. Yeah, because we used to use Teams. That's why. So
Yeah,
maybe
so
the
maybe he
links
has
have
the
been a bit
old
messed
link.
up.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah, yeah.
then I will resend the Zoom link.
Okay. Yeah, do you do that for me then?
Yeah, I will
Okay,
do.
thanks. Thank you.
Okay, I resent the link and told him that I did so. So sorry for the delay. Hope it
No worries,
will
no
work
worries.
now.
Oh, okay. Here he is. Nice.
Fantastic.
Hello. Can you hear us?
Achim, you're muted.
Oh, true.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I don't hear you yet. This is not so great. Now?
We can hear you. Well,
Great.
at least I can.
Now
Yeah.
I hear you.
Okay, cool.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what happened. Like I got a team, I clicked on the wrong mail of you, but there was a Teams link in, and it was like, oh, nice, everything's working, and then I was
Yeah, that's okay. I was telling Patrick, we used to use Teams. That's why. So maybe it's an old link or something. Yeah.
Sorry,
No worries. Okay, so today we have Patrick and Achim. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, Achim.
Achim. So they're going to talk about language prediction and the origins of understanding. So I guess, Patrick, you're starting then?
Yeah.
Cool. So if you can
just
share
a
your
quick
screen.
organizatory step. Like we are at different locations, one in Erlangen, one in Mannheim. So I will open my own talk then. That's okay, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you prefer. Like, yeah.
Okay, okay, great. Good.
Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, perfect. Then I will start. So,
Perfect.
first of all, thank you for inviting us to present our research. Again, actually, so we already had the pleasure to join your theoretical neurobiology seminar a few years ago. So, as already announced, the title of our presentation is Language Prediction and the Origins of Understanding, so bridging neurobiology and artificial intelligence. And I will start with the first part of the talk, and then I will hand over to Achim. So first of all, let me briefly introduce ourselves. So we both did a master in physics, to be more precise, in theoretical biophysics. Then we both did a PhD in neuroscience. And now we are running our groups. So Achim is running a group on BCI and Neuro AI at the Medical Faculty Mannheim of the University Heidelberg, and I myself run a group on cognitive computational neuroscience and Neuro AI at the University Erlangen. So in our research, broadly speaking, we combine neuroscience-inspired AI and cognitive computational neuroscience. So we consider both to be two sides of the same coin, actually. So we try to answer the questions, how can insights from neuroscience enhance AI? And we draw algorithmic inspiration and use neuroscience methods to investigate and improve contemporary AI systems. And on the other hand, we asked the question, how can AI help us to understand the brain? And here we use AI both as a tool and as a model to further investigate and to simulate certain parts of the brain. So this is all inspired by the famous quote of Richard Feynman. So what I cannot create, I do not understand. We combine a broad spectrum of research methods in our groups. So from experimental methods like EEG, MEG, and implanted EEG electrodes to computational methods, so computational modeling, simulation, and machine learning and data science, to theoretical concepts from physics, and in particular, dynamical systems theory, information theory. So what we want to present today is our research on language and on language understanding in humans and in AI system. And we wanted to, so we try to answer the question, how do humans learn language, and can the first language be learned at all, or is it innate to a certain respect? So, and before I go on with presenting the first study, I want to introduce some basic terms, because I was told that you have a broad spectra of backgrounds, and so that everyone is on track. So syntax is the set of rules that we use to arrange words in sentences. So it's roughly speaking, syntax is grammar. Then in language is important semantics, which deals with the meaning of words and sentences, and pragmatics, which is about the meaning of language in social and physical contexts. So, for instance, when I ask Achim, do you know what time it is? I do not really want to know whether he knows what time is it, but actually I want him to tell me what time is it. So this is all covered by the subfield pragmatics within linguistics. So can language be learned at all, or is it innate? And what might be the origin of language? So there were first experiments to answer this question already 2,500 years ago, so approximately 600 BC. The pharaoh Psammetics did kind of a cruel experiment. So he gave two newborn to a shepherd and told him that no one should talk to the children. And the idea was that the first word that these newborn would say would be from the root language of all languages. And of course, nowadays we know that first of all, so this is a completely cruel experiment, and we wouldn't repeat something like this nowadays. And on the other hand, we of course know that language is learned and not completely innate. However, there are two schools of thought within contemporary linguistics, which we will see in a couple of minutes. So first of all, what is language? So according to linguistics, language has at least 5 main characteristics. So first of all, language is communicative. So this means it serves the purpose to transmit and comprehend information. This is kind of common sense. Then language is arbitrary. So this means that the symbols that represent certain things are arbitrary in the way that they are not naturally related to the objects they stand for. So so you see this for different languages, and of course even for British and American English, where you have different words like truck and lorry for the same object, for the same concept. So it's arbitrary. Then, of course, as we already heard, language is structured, which means that the ordering of symbols is by no means random, but follows a set of given rules, so which is basically the grammar of the language at hand. Then language is generative. This means that given the set of symbols and the set of rules, we can, in principle, build a nearly infinite number of sentences and meanings and ideas and concepts. So language is extremely powerful, and it is dynamic. So language is not static, but it changes over time. So for instance, the word tweet 20 years ago was just a sound, the sound of a bird. But nowadays, if I use the word tweet, most people will associate a message on Twitter or some other social media. And furthermore, language is maybe the most, so the hallmark of the human species. So it most clearly distinguishes our species from other species. Of course, other species also communicate. So, for instance, we know that orcas have a very elaborated and quite complex language. However, it is by no means as complex and powerful as the human language, as at least as far as we know. So, what we do, or what we did in the first study, is that we used artificial neural networks as tiny models for the brain. And this approach is called cognitive computational neuroscience. So Nicolas Kriegeskorte introduced this term basically. And we wanted to distinguish between two competing schools of thought in linguistics. So there is one school of thought which is called universal grammar, and it goes back to Noam Chomsky, so maybe the most famous linguist. And he had the idea that humans must have some innate or even genetically determined language faculty. For instance, that humans from birth on can distinguish between different word classes like nouns, verbs, or adjectives. Because so this hypothesis is driven by the idea that the linguistic input that a child receives from birth to adulthood is extremely sparse compared to the large amount of texts we use to train large language models, for instance. So, and from this lack of good and of much enough input, so to say, the hypothesis was born that there must be something like universal grammar, so already known knowledge about a language that is then simply shaped during individual development and during language acquisition, so very roughly speaking. So, and some scientists even claimed that they found the neural correlate of universal grammar in the brain to be more precise. They say that Broca's area, and in particular the arcuate fasciculus, which connects Broca's area to Wernicke's area, so which connects the two language areas that are most important for language understanding and language production, that this might be the neural correlate or the anatomical correlate, to be more exact, of universal grammar. On the other hand, so the other major school of thought in linguistics is called cognitive linguistics. And here it is suggested a close link between language structure and everyday use. And cognitive linguistics highlights that our brain's ability to adapt to diverse language patterns. And it also claims that linguistic structures might evolve during language acquisition and might not be innate at the first place. And we tried with a study to, kind of to deliver our one piece to kind of try to decide between these two major schools of thought and these competing hypotheses. And our starting point was that we said, okay, so we already know that prediction is a well-known processing principle of the brain. So I don't want to go into further detail here, because I assume that all of you are very well familiar with this concept of predictive coding and the Bayesian brain framework, which formalizes this. So I will skip this to not bore you, and I will jump into the actual study that we recently published. So to repeat, we wanted to answer the question, is prediction enough to build some internal understanding, or to be more exact, internal representation of grammar in a simple neural network that we trained exclusively on next word prediction. So we used a simple artificial neural network as a model system, and it was really a tiny neural network. So compared to the large language models like ChatGPT, it was a tiny language model. And we trained this network by feeding in sequences of words from a German novel. So, and in particular, 9 words in a row sequentially. And the task of the network was to predict the 10th word. And so we constructed this neural network from LSTMs, which are a mathematical model of recurrent neurons and recurrent neural layers. So and this was so we made this decision because we considered this to be more biologically plausible, and so the brain is highly recurrent, as you know. And we could demonstrate in another study that in LSTMs even spiking behavior is possible. So we considered LSTMs to be a good model system, and we trained serially. So we fed in the input words serially and not in parallel, as it is done in contemporary transformers. And after we trained this neural network, and I have to admit that the resulting accuracy was well above chance level, of course, but it was far away from what we, of course, see from ChatGPT and other large language models. So the resulting accuracy was something like 40%. So this is extremely significantly above chance level, but of course far away from being useful. But we were not interested in maximizing the accuracy. We were interested in which internal representations emerged in this neural network. And to investigate the internal representations after training, we used basically 2 main methods, one for visualization and one to quantify the qualitative visualizations. So, and for visualization, we use dimensionality reduction, in particular multidimensional scaling. So this method projects the high-dimensional activations of the internal hidden layers of the neural network onto a 2D plane. And it does so by preserving all mutual Euclidean distances. And in this context, Euclidean distance is a proxy for dissimilarity. So the closer 2 points are on this projection or in state space, the more similar they are, and the more distinct 2 points are in the projection or in the original high-dimensional state space, the more dissimilar they are. And as in order to not only qualitatively visualize the activations, but also to quantify the degree of clustering, we used the so-called generalized discrimination value, which we published in other studies previously. And basically, it is the normalized average of the differences between the inter and the intra-cluster distances. So, and what did we find? So first we examined the input layer, and we projected for different input sentences, so for different input sequences consisting of 9 words, the internal activations, and projected them on a 2D plane with MDS. And then we color-coded the dots, and how we choose the color coding I will explain in a few minutes. But first of all, what we saw in the input layer basically is that we see no clustering. So that obviously no information about word classes, and this is exactly how we choose the color coding. So we choose the color coding according to the word class of the word to be predicted, because we wanted to see if something as abstract as linguistic word classes could emerge in a neural network that is solely trained with language examples on predicting the next word. And in the input layer, we see no clustering according to this color coding. So this means that the information about word classes and grammar is not part of the input. So because one could argue that the word vectors that we used from the word-to-vec model to translate the words into vectors and that we then used as input for the network, they could already contain certain syntactical or grammatical information. And this is not the case, as we see here. However, if we then take a closer look at the last layer, or to be honest, to be more precisely, the second last layer, then we see a clear clustering. So this means that in this second last layer, the neural network organizes the representation of the input word sequences according to the word class of the word to be predicted. So, and we found that this result is kind of spectacular because no one told the neural network anything about word classes at all, but somehow the neural network self-organized or kind of figured out that for the task at hand, namely predicting the next word, there must be or there might be something like word classes, and they might be useful for the task at hand. And if you imagine the task, so predicting the next word, so this is an incredibly hard task, of course, in particular for a small language model. So imagine I take randomly out of the shelf some book and then open it at some random page, and then I start to read, and after 9 words I stop reading, and then I ask you which word comes next. So it's almost impossible to guess the correct word here, of course. However, if you guess a word that is at least grammatically correct, then you are at least not entirely wrong. And this is what obviously this neural network did to reach an accuracy which is highly significant above chance level. So the neural network somehow figured out the syntactic structure and information about word classes and used this information to guess the at least grammatically correct next word. So this shows that in principle, even something abstract as linguistic word classes can emerge in a neural network trained with language examples on next word prediction. So, and here to make the story complete is the already mentioned GDV, so the generalized discrimination value, which quantifies the degree of clustering in a given point cloud. And you have to know that the clustering is better the more negative the GDV is. So a smaller GDV stands for a higher degree of clustering. And here we see the GDV as a function of the layer. And as we see from the figure at the top left, from the first layer, there is almost no clustering. So there is a completely random point cloud according to the color coding, so according to the word classes of the word to be predicted. However, in layer 5, so at the top right figure, we see a very clear clustering, which is mirrored by the GDV with a relatively high quantity for the degree of clustering. So in this study we recently published in a conference paper, and we were also able to publish a follow-up study in a book chapter which will come out in a few weeks, where we extended this study for other languages and for next two-word prediction. And here we found that, interestingly, also word class combinations emerge as representations in the neural network. And a word class bigram, a word class combination of two word classes, can already be seen as the kind of building block of more abstract and more complex grammar rules. So, summing up this first study, neural networks are a valid model that help to understand the brain. And as I already said, abstract linguistic categories like word classes can emerge spontaneously in neural representations of linguistic input. And by that, we demonstrated that the grammar was actually learned by just predicting the next word. So this challenges the view that grammatical properties or knowledge about word classes have to be hardwired in the brain. And we can finally state that, yes, prediction is actually enough to let something as abstract as word classes emerge, at least in a tiny artificial neural network. And now the question arises, how about the human brain? So a big biological neural network. And with this, I want to hand over to my colleague Achim, who will present then the follow-up study.
Okay, thank you very much. I also need to share my screen, so please, Patrick, stop it.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice. Okay. Quickly check. So today I have some, it's relatively tricky to, but I hope now you see my screen and I can open the talk. So do you see it now?
Yeah, we can see that.
Great, great, great. I'm happy for that. So I quickly go to the point where Patrick stopped. So perfect. If you see then the slide prediction, syntax, and semantic grounding, we are on the same page. Great, perfect. So thank you very much, Patrick, for the introduction into the theory and the artificial neural network study. And we had a very simple artificial neural network. Now I think we go to the most complex artificial neural network we know, our human brain. And first of all, I want to present you our first study on that, called Prediction, Syntax, and Semantic Grounding in the Brain and Large Language Models, which we performed together with the University Hospital in Erlangen, the University Hospital in Mannheim of the University Heidelberg, and a cooperation partner in Zurich in Switzerland. And what was our first question we wanted to answer in this study? Unfortunately, it's not so complex and interesting as the question Patrick posed before. The problem is we are limited in our methods, so we cannot read out every neuron at every time point, and therefore we have to do a step-by-step approach to get more knowledge for obvious reason. So our first question we wanted to answer is, can we at least identify word class related neural activity in the brain? And what we did was to perform MEG, so magnetoencephalogram measurements, and combined EEG measurements. So on the left part, in the left edge, you see our MEG device, and the participant in this MEG device also has an EEG cap, and we could measure both of it in parallel. And as stimulus, we used an audiobook, from Philip P. Patterson called Vacuum, which is basically a nice science fiction book, so people liked it. And we presented 50 minutes of this audiobook, had 248 channels in the MEG, 64 channels in the EEG that measured the neural signal related to this audiobook signal. And what we had to do is to do a so-called forced alignment. So we had to find the word boundaries in this continuous speech stream. And here on the lower plot, you see these red pulses, which are basically the trigger pulses we found from this forced alignment word tagging. So we know when every word starts, and we can use this for later evaluation. These curve below, this is the typical MEG raw signal, and as you see nothing. So the signal to noise ratio for non-implanted electrodes is always very bad. So in most cases, you have to basically average to get any signal out of it. And what we did first is the most basic analysis you could guess. And this is just to calculate so-called ERFs and ERPs, which are basically the same thing, but ERFs are so-called event-related fields, and this is done in an MEG and an EEG. The same analysis is called ERP. And what you basically do, you just average the neuronal signal for all stimuli. And in this case, we just use the word boundaries we already knew and sorted the words according to the word type, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and proper nouns, and took a look at the event-related fields and event-related potentials. And what we see is that there are significant differences between the different word classes in the MEG and in the EEG. We split the data before we did the analysis in a so-called exploration data set and validation data set. This procedure is inspired by machine learning, where I have a training data set and a test data set, and we wanted to be sure that we do not get effects exclusively by wrong sampling of the data. So we wanted to see the effects in the exploration data set and the validation data set. And that's exactly what happens. So it's reproducible. If you have the effect in the exploration data set, you also have it in the validation data set. And then we know, okay, the brain has some certain encoding of different word classes, which is unique to the word class. So at least we know there is some word class specific activity in the brain after a word occurs. The problem is, as I already showed you, there's also significant difference between the MEG and the EEG data. And this is for obvious reason, so that we also have some kind of physics in here, like the E field, the electrical field is perpendicular to the magnetic field. Therefore, the one method measures the Curie and the one method measures the Sulky, and therefore it's difficult to compare it. So what we did is the next typical analysis to do a so-called Swiss space reconstruction. So we project the activity using a brain model onto the brain surface. And what we find is that in nouns, especially in the post-central and the pre-central gyrus, and the activity is higher than for verbs, which basically means that nouns elicited a deeper semantic activation by engaging sensory and motor cortices. And this is in line with the idea or with the hypothesis of embodied cognition. The brain does not treat words as an abstract symbol only. Instead, it partially simulates sensory and motor states tied to meaning. So, which in easy word, this just means if you see a rose, your brain already activates, okay, I know how it smells, I know how it looks, I know the color, and so on. And here you already see the big problem. That is the thing that artificial neural networks do not do, because they never experience real nature or reality because they have no body. And we will come to this point later, but we wanted to ask a further question. Does the brain not only encode different word classes in a different way, does it also predict different word classes in a different way? And therefore, we calculated a grand average and looked at the time point before a word occurred. So we looked at the signal and then we just calculated an ERP again and looked at the time before a certain word occurred. And it's funny because there's already some activity before, for example, the noun is presented, but there is not much activity before, for example, a verb and an adjective is presented. And therefore, we guess or we hypothesize that the brain predicts different word classes with a different accuracy and in a different way. But the problem is, if you now think back to the talk of Patrick, where we really used prediction as the learning paradigm, we don't know if this is in the brain the same thing because we have only one time point. So we do not know if like prediction is the basis or prediction is just the result. So this is not enough to divide between the two theories, but it's a next step. And at least we know that the brain predicts different word classes with different accuracy. And now we have some neuronal data, but we want to better understand the algorithms behind it. So we want to understand brain processing on an algorithmic level, but this is not easy because we have just some neuronal signal, some neuro image, but we do not have any algorithm. So therefore, we wanted to compare our signals to algorithms we already at least understand partially. And I would say the topic of the last 2 years are the so-called large language models, so ChatGPT or whatever. And in this case, we use Meta's model Llama because it has a relatively good accuracy and it is open source. And just as a quick repetition, what a large language model does. As input, it just takes a sequence of words with meaning. And here, for example, we have the sentence LLMs, so large language models are cool, and every word, and in this case also the letter S, has its own embedding. So these are called the tokens, and then we add to each token a so-called positional encoding, which we do not have to discuss in further detail. This is just a value that says, is a word at the beginning of a sentence or the end of a sentence? And then we have so-called multi-head mask self-attention. And this basically does nothing else than just changing these input tokens by adding context to each of this token. This means the word LLM does not only carry its own meaning, but also carries the meaning of are cool, which basically means every token now contains information on the whole meaning of the sentence or the whole sequence. And the good thing is you can train this kind of neural network because it's highly parallelized, and we have a lot of data, the whole internet full of text, and you train it on this, and what you basically train it on is just to predict the next token. So what is the next word in the row? And if you then generate text, if you tell ChatGPT, please answer this question, ChatGPT does nothing else than just predicting the next word and therefore generating text. And we did some experiment with Llama. So first of all, we fed in indeed text step by step. So unfortunately, it's a German book, so I have to translate. So basically, we fed in the sentence, die Hyaden liegen im Zentrum, like the Hyads are in the center of, and we feed in each sentence word by word. So the first thing is the Hyads lie, and the sentence becomes longer and longer, and we predict always the next word. And what we found out, we called it semantic predictability, which is somehow our own invention. We just did that to divide between different experiments, but this is the first experiment, the semantic predictability experiment. And what we found out, if you feed in every word step by step, that nouns are easier to predict than verbs, adjectives, and proper nouns, which is already relatively funny because this is exactly where also in the brain signal we had the highest activity before the noun occurred. Then we did a further analysis. We fed in the whole text at once, And you see it in the panel below, where you have again the sentence, die Hyaden liegen im Zentrum des, and we fed it in a parallel. And now we have a sequence of word classes. And we trained a so-called probe classifier on predicting the next word class by getting just the representation of the previous word, which means we fed in, for example, the word die, which means the, and the classifier was trained to predict that the next word, in this case Hyaden, is a proper noun. And we wanted to find out how good this works. And indeed, this works. It's far above chance level. So basically, this means there is some kind of prediction going on along this sequence of words. But now what we see is that nouns and adjectives are often mixed up. Why is it like this? Yeah, it's relatively easy to explain, because you never know if you hear the word the, if the next word is an adjective or if it's a noun, because it might be the big dog or it might be just the dog. And this is the problem. Therefore, these two word classes are mixed up. But if you then go to later layer, it works better because you get more context and the network already remembers more of the context, and then you can guess better if it's an adjective before or not. It already also depends on the writing style of the author, for example. And as you already see, like if you do this kind of analysis, you generate more questions that you actually answer. But yeah, at some point you have to start, and I think it's relatively interesting. I want to quickly summarize the ideas just on syntax processing. So if you remember back to the ERPs and ERFs, so we found indeed distinct neural signatures for different word classes. This you already also find in Llama 3.2. So also the word encodings carry in later layers some information on the word class. In the semantic prediction, we found in the brain that the predictive activity is strongest before nouns. And indeed, also in this experiment, Llama showed that the prediction confidence is highest for nouns if you feed in the data step by step. In the next experiments, we did Llama, fed in everything as a whole, and trained these probe classifiers. And we found that Llama's hidden state contain indeed non-random predictive info about the next word class. So Llama had some information on the word class of the next word in his hidden layers. And indeed, the pre-onset ERP-ERF activity in the brain shows that the brain is actively anticipating upcoming words. But like, we do not bring these two observations totally together yet. And where we have really a big difference is in the grounding thing, because as if you think back on the source space reconstructions, indeed in the brain nouns activate sensory motor regions in the pre and post-sensory gyri. So the meaning is tied to a bodily experience, also called embodied cognition. We don't have that for obvious reason in large language models, because they never saw the real world, which does not mean that they cannot imitate to do so, but just by experience they got in text form from real persons. And don't be scared, I just will show one plot of the follow-up study, or the second part of the study, called the predictive brain neural correlates of word expectancy aligned with large language model prediction probabilities. Therefore, we used a different language model, namely BERT, which is an older one, and it is bidirectional. So now you do not just go to one direction, but the whole network knows also the next word, not just the word before. And we did some analysis with this. And what we found, indeed, we fed in again the text step by step and predicted the next word, but we did not take care of any word class anymore and just calculated how good does BERT predict the next word. And this, we correlated then this word expectancy from the LLM, we correlated with the so-called N400 wave. I do not know if you are familiar with this concept, but there is a large negativity in EEG, ERPs, and if there is some semantic violation, which is unexpected, so I would say it's some kind of sign of semantic surprisal, and it's relatively funny because like the predictability calculated from BERT is highly negatively correlated with the N400 wave. This sounds complicated, but it's really relatively easy. So if the LLM says, this word does not surprise me, then also the brain says, this word does not surprise me. And it looks the same, but we switch the axis for the next plot just to keep comparability between MEG and EEG data. But for the activity of the neural signal before the word, the correlation is the other way around, which means prediction activity in the brain is positively correlated to the predictability score of BERT, which really means if BERT says this word is easy to predict, then also our brain says this word is easy to predict. And I want to conclude these studies in some takeaway messages, but I have to say these takeaway messages are not fixed. So I think we are here to discuss today and get some input, but because you already see there are so many open endings and open questions, so we need the input to further and better understand what we indeed measured. But my, let's say, takeaway messages for now are that we found similar effects that emerged in two different systems, the biological brain and artificial neural networks, namely the large language models. And in vivo and in silico, both systems show that language relies on prediction and context. And this raises one big question: how can such different architectures converge on the same principles? And do they, or do we just think that they do so? And to go even one step further, are there basic principles which we call Platonic attractors, which every system which goes over a certain grade of complexity reaches, and therefore we can see basically these algorithms as specialty cases of one so-called Platonic attractor. But yeah, also therefore we would like to have some feedback. But before we start discussion, I quickly want to thank people that are related to this kind of research. So first of all, you for your attention and for the input you will hopefully give us later. And we want to thank our groups, so my group, the NeuroAI and BCI group in Mannheim and at the University in Heidelberg, and the Mannheim Center for Neuroprosthetics and Neuromodulation, led by Thomas Kimpfe, Professor Thomas Kimpfe, who is really visionary scientist, and the CCN group, the group of Patrick Krauss in Erlangen. So if you want to connect, please connect via LinkedIn. And quickly, our main funder is the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, this German Research Foundation. Also, thank you to them. And yeah, I'm really happy for your input and your questions. And I've quickly listed some questions which might be also interesting for you and are especially interesting for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much both for the presentation. Really cool, really interesting. So now we move to the Q&A session discussion. So if there are any questions on the chat, please raise your hand. I have one related to well, might be related to both, but it's specifically to the experiment you were showing, Patrick, at the end of the bit of your presentation. So you were saying that the model doesn't get to maximum accuracy, let's say. So can we think in some sense that that model is under capacity or not hitting the maximum capacity that it should have in order to fully learn the generative model, let's say, to predict what it has to predict with like maximum accuracy, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, you have to consider that the model we trained. So first of all, it was relatively small compared to the huge
Yeah.
language models with their billions of artificial weights and parameters. So our neural network only consisted of 5 hidden layers, and each layer consisted of approximately 1 to 200 neurons. So it was really tiny, and we also the training data set was relatively tiny. So it was just one single German novel and not a huge corpus. And so I think we could have increased or maximized the accuracy by scaling up both the network and the training data set, but this was so
Yeah, no, sorry.
not the aim of our research.
Yeah, no, that's not my question. So my question is, given that that's under capacity, as you are saying, right? Like
Yeah.
the model is not huge and there's like a scarcity in the data and so on. I don't know if that could be interesting, whether the clusterings that you get in the word space, let's say the word category space that you show, would that kind of clustering, I mean, that should definitely change as you change the capacity of the model, right? So the higher the capacity, maybe the more fine-grained the different clusters, or the lower the capacity, maybe you cannot actually model all the different word categories, and maybe the model just collapses to 2 modes, let's say.
Yeah, of course. So now I got it. Yeah, of course. So I think what this shows is that so the main word classes like nouns, verbs, adjectives, so they seem to be so fundamental that they even emerge in this small neural network. But of course, if you would scale it up, then we might found subclusters, so more fine-grained representations. And actually, in follow-up projects and studies, which I didn't present today, we did. So one of my PhD students analyzed the difference between prepositional verbs and phrasal verbs, and found a subclustering in the representation of prepositional verbs and phrasal verbs in English. So the answer is yes. So if you scale up the neural network and the training data, then more complex and more fine-grained representations emerge. But
Yeah, and could there be other? I don't know exactly how could that be done, because it doesn't seem like straightforward. But could that somehow be measured, whether there's some correlation between the different levels of coarse grain as a function of capacity, compare that to what the brain might be doing, also under different capacity constraints? I don't know if that's, to what extent that's plausible to do, but it could be another way to see whether you find like these same ways of like clustering and representing things under different regimes of constraints, let's say.
Yeah, so we didn't think about this possibility so far, but it is definitely a very interesting question. So we will try to keep this in mind in follow-up studies. But so my feeling is that so the human brain is already the kind of the most elaborated and the most complex neural network we know. So it is a good approach to search in the brain for more let's say, fine-grained categories or representations on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, the really large language models are a good model system that can be more easily investigated than the human brain. And there we already found more fine-grained representations, of course. So this is ongoing research. So we are going in this direction, but so far we did not a study where we systematically down or upscaled the capacity of a neural network to learn about which clusters emerge first. But this is a really interesting thought. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So let's see if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I find your result about noun prediction very interesting, and I'll try and explain why. I build language models of language production and comprehension based on cognitive linguistics. Now, they're not neural net models, they are unification-based models, and I see unification as a Bayesian operation. So in these models, nouns are handled differently from verbs and adjectives and so on. And the difference is that a noun is a pairing of a word sound and a meaning, and you can process a noun more or less immediately you hear the sound or immediately you have the meaning. Whereas a verb, before you can convert the sound to a meaning, you have to have some nouns around it, subject and the object. So verb processing is kind of delayed in these models. So that's a difference, which may mean that nouns are easier. You get a more signal in the brain for nouns. But I emphasize these are not neural net models at all. They're all models at Mars level 2. But they are Bayesian models, so they do relate to the free energy principle quite, and they could have a neural implementation that way. That's the comment.
Yeah, thank you. So this is
fantastic. That's really, thank you very much. Like, I did not think about that, but this is really great because it would also explain a different effect. Because if you get to deeper layer, for example, of the large language model, you get always more context to the verbs, which basically means then they also get easier to predict. Which is exactly what you said, because the delay is then basically merged into the verb representation, but it's not like that in the layer at the beginning, and this explains it in a very good way.
So maybe this has also something to do with, so you said that, so nouns, if you hear a noun, you immediately have the meaning of the noun because it is associated.
Yeah, I think the brain can convert a noun to a meaning straight away, but for a verb, it has to wait.
Yeah. So, but does this also, so is this also true for more abstract nouns? So it's clear for concrete nouns like, let's say, apple, table, dog. But if I hear, let's say, democracy or freedom, then it might be more complicated.
Indeed, no idea about that. I've only worked with concrete nouns, really.
Yeah. So are you familiar with the experiments that Friedemann Pulvermüller does? So he's based in Berlin, and he found, for instance, that if you hear a verb, then, so at least concrete verbs for movement, so something like running, walking, going, then the motor cortex is co-activated. So in a very similar way, like the temporal areas are co-activated for object recognition and representation if you listen to words like table, apple, or dog.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that work. I'd like to hear more about that work. It's very interesting to me because my whole view of language is semantics first, and by the motor cortex, you get at semantics.
Mm-hmm.
Nick,
work that favors cognitive linguistics over Chomsky linguistics, by the way. It's my personal bias.
Me too.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It's quite a coincidence. I'm currently based in Mannheim as well, but at the University of Mannheim. So really cool to be logged in from such close proximity. I think it's somehow fitting to the topic, but I did some work with Jeremy Skipper's lab at UCL for my master thesis, and he looks at naturalistic language processing throughout the brain while during movie watching paradigms. What sort of his research, and by extension my master thesis, sort of seem to indicate is that distinct word categories like even if you go into specific meanings like emotional language, negative language, physical language, and so on, seems to have distinct neural signatures that can be correctly classified and decoded by, in my case, it was a support vector machine. So the support vector machine was able to take the data and indicate which kind of language it was. In another dimension, which might be interesting for you to look at, is we talk about this importance of context. And what we were also interested in is the importance of psychological context. So what kind of psychological state someone is in, whether they're anxious or depressed and so on and so forth. And there seem to be very interesting and promising results that even something like the psychological states seem to crucially alter the kind of neuronal architecture that is involved in language processing. So I hope that's somehow useful and fits to your topic, and just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. So
so thank you very much. Like, it's nice to have some colleagues in Mannheim. Unfortunately, the wrong university, but doesn't matter. It's interesting, but I think we wouldn't need and at some point we would need a whole bunch of new experiments, right? Because at some point you have to reproducibly put the participants into different emotional states, and this is not so easy, right? You can put them under pressure and stress them out. Yeah, always not so good for the ethics committee, but this is doable. But to really make them happy, or I think you have a lot of difficulty to measure that, but I think that will have a huge influence. So thank you very much for the input. And at some point we will think how we could realize that.
So by the way, this might also work with large language models. So we are collaborating with some guys in Switzerland, and they try to figure out interestingness of images, and so how interesting is a given image in terms of how long do you look at this image, or do you look at the image at all? And they backbone this with large vision language models, and then they kind of use also the large vision language models as so-called personas for different characters. So they start with an initial prompt, so something like imagine your 40-year-old nurse in a South African hospital, and you already worked 15 hours this day. And then what's interesting is that which images are considered as interesting completely changes compared to the original state of this large vision language model. And this is kind of, so by that you can even, so you could even go as far as claim that you can also bring large language models in different moods or different states, and then they also behave differently. And this might be a very interesting complement to the study you suggested.
Yeah, it's funny that you had this in mind, because that's exactly what I had in mind when I said, the large language model do not have something like embodied cognition and so on, but they can imitate it somehow, which is really weird, because they really, in this interesting study, they were really able somehow to imitate the behavior of real persons. So it correlated nicely, which is totally funny, because like, where do they get this kind of knowledge and really behave like this? So I don't know, like, it's this interesting topic.
Nice. I guess that if there are no more questions or comments, we can pass it on to you, Carl.
Right, it's my turn now, is it?
Yep.
All right, good, thank you. Well, thank you for a pair of wonderful presentations and the ensuing conversations. Yeah, there are lots of things we can talk about. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to say anything very useful because I was just entertained by what you have done and the progress that you've made. But with an eye to sort of future pointing things that you might want to think about, I've just been picking out a few papers that may be of interest. Some of them I'm sure you will have read, others possibly not. So I'll just go through those just to remind myself of what I was thinking. Um, the, 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 the nature of the feedback, I think, inherits from what was on your initial slides, namely that which I cannot create, I do not understand. And in that spirit, I am wondering whether it would be useful to show that a generative modeling approach, as seen through the lens of the free energy principle and active inference, as distinct from generative AI, where there's no explicit generative model, may be a useful point of reference to show that some of the phenomena that you have elicited both in the neural networks and in the real neuronal networks in the brain are indeed observable empirically. So instead of saying, we can elicit the same kind of phenomena from a neuronal network and a neural network in the context of language processing, and therefore, because they share these response profiles, there must be some architectural isomorphism there. Start from the philosophical position that under the hypothesis that the brain uses generative models to sense make and generate language, can we find evidence for similar phenomena in large language models and indeed sort of measures of the brain using EEG and MEG. So that's what I was just looking out for. Is there a first principle account of some of the phenomena that you've identified? I haven't found many, but I found a couple. So I'll just share those with you. And then I repeat, the idea here is that you can say, look, if the brain uses a generative model of a particular sort to do language, then we would expect this. And then when we look for this, either in a real brain or in a synthetic brain, i.e. a large language model, yes, we find it in both. And that sort of puts it more on a sort of hypothesis testing as opposed to I've found similarities between the brain and the large language models. Just to preface that sort of sentiment, though, if one's starting with the hypothesis that the brain is using a generative model to infer and generate language, what are the architectural principles that you would want to comment upon? And indeed, you have already commented upon. So some of my sort of feedback is just to celebrate some of the sort of cardinal issues that you were bringing to the table about the fundamental nature of these implicit or on one view requisite generative models. And two themes come to mind. One is the fact that it is, well, I'm just thinking about Patrick's sort of 5 criteria desiderata, the axioms of language. And it struck me that they all sort of, in a sense, follow from each other. I can't remember exactly now, but there was all of them seemed to be entirely plausible and, in fact, necessary consequences of a relational approach to language, by which I mean that language can only emerge if we all share the same narrative or the same hymn sheet or the same generative model. That could emerge if we all shared the same world and we have a generative model of that world. And now, because we share the same world, we are now in a position to share our beliefs about that world, if and only if we have a shared narrative. And it just struck me that a lot of the 5 points could be framed in that. You had generative, so you could start with, well, this implies a generative model of the mapping between cause and consequence. But the relational aspects seem to underwrite a lot of the 5 things. Again, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but I do remember thinking, yes, that can only be the case if you now think of me in relation to you wanting to communicate, for example. I mean, communication only makes sense if there are common ground, to use a Tomasello notion, a shared frame of reference, to use a Chris Field's quantum information theoretic approach, a common frame of reference, and more colloquially, we are all singing from the same song sheet or the same hymn sheet. So you can't communicate unless you have that shared narrative, which I think speaks to a really interesting and sort of almost philosophically historical problem of hermeneutics. Deciphering the old sea scrolls. What did they mean? Can they communicate with me if I can understand what they mean? So I thought that was that was an interesting point. It doesn't speak much to a NeurIPS or a machine learning paper, but for a synthes or a sort of physics of life paper, a paragraph just emphasizing that relational, shared, collective, federated aspect is important. And it does speak to the question is, why are large language models such compelling digital twins for ourselves? And of course, you could argue, well, they've just been trained on and only on everything that we have shared. In the sense that you just give it everything that has been generated that is shared. So language just is that intersection between everybody who can communicate, and it is the product of a shared narrative and a shared generative model. Of course, now there are arguments about the embodiment and that, but the core notion that this is that language rests upon communication, which rests upon a shared generative model that is relational. Does, I think, license the hypothesis that the reason large language models just make so much sense is that they are trained on that stuff that is shared, which we share, and therefore we can understand the large language model. It seems almost commonsensical, but I think does deserve a bit more celebration in the right kind of paper. The other issue which came to mind was the separation of temporal scales, which was implicit in your presentations, but perhaps not as explicit as you could make it if you referred to language processing simulations of under generative models. And the first thing you realize is that all of the generative models, whether we're going from the classical hierarchical Dirichlet models in computational linguistics through to work in active inference on language generation, they all have deep temporal structure. They all have a separation of temporal scales. And of course, you were talking about that in terms of context. It's not just this word, it's the context in which it is embedded. But of course, the context lasts longer in terms of clock or universal time than the actual instance of the word in question. So immediately deeper in the neural networks, you've got something that is contextual. It provides contextual constraints. In my world, these will be empirical priors. But crucially, these empirical priors have a greater temporal scope, and therefore they are updated more slowly than the updating at the lower level. So, take an attention head in transformer architecture. That is informed, as you say, by the entire sentence, but the entire sentence lasts longer in universal time than any instance of the word within that. So again, I'm saying this in terms of this would be in the discussion of a synthes paper. It wouldn't be in the introduction, but it's something I think you could wax lyrical about, that there's an implicit separation of temporal scales in the implicit generative models that are necessary to accommodate language. One way of looking at that is in terms of sort of the renormalization group and scale invariance. And if you put scale invariance onto a network, you now have a scale-free network. Another consequence of that is that you are breaking the Markovian nature of language models. So you cannot predict the next word given just the last word. So you are no longer, you're now moving into the world of non-Markovian processes. And as soon as you do that, you are implicitly saying there is a separation of temporal scales. There's no one unique temporal scale, because if it was one unique temporal scale and I could predict stuff, I just need what happened recently. But in virtue of the fact that you have to look deep into the past, so the history of what's going on informs, and the contextual history informs the prediction of the next word, tells you immediately you're dealing with a very non-Markovian kind of generative model, or the kind of dependencies, predictive dependencies that inherit from a generative model with the separation of temporal scales, or can be summarized in terms of the deep history of that embeds the context of the next word. And of course, that's, from an engineer's point of view, that would lead you immediately to sort of nonlinear autoregressive like predictions that are now equipped with the right kind of context sensitivity that accommodates the attention heads. So those two themes I'm going to try and highlight, but in the service of when those two themes are in play, can you explain these lovely correlations between the degree of predictability and the induced responses, either in the ERFs or the ERPs or the what else? An N400 effect. Are these emergent properties? If I put a generative model with separation of temporal scales or deep temporal structure in the service of trying to predict the next word. So that's where I'm going. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just share. I've probably got too many things to share, papers. Some of them are going completely irrelevant, but I'll try and make sense of the ones. Right. So the first thing was just a couple of pointers. Are you talking to Stevan Harnad in Montreal? Right. Okay. So I'm not. I haven't been following him or his workshops or series of online presentations as closely as one could if one was committed to this sort of idea, understanding large language models in relation to neuroscience and vice versa. But he's really focused on this. So he's the editor of Animal Sentience, and he was one of the co-founders of Behavior and Brain Sciences. So he loves these sort of deep conceptual arguments about about the nature of sentience, and has become very, very focused on large language models, and nearly every week invites somebody to speak on this issue as part of a seminar series. But he also had this understanding LLM understanding. I just put this up just to remind you. Oh, we haven't got his name. That's a shame. Okay, right. So the reason, yes, he should be here. Where is he? Stevan Harnad in he's got a subsidiary appointment in Southampton, UK, but his primary appointment is at in Montreal, University of Quebec. I think you should go and look at his website and go and look at the participants of these talks on this web page here, and tell him about your work and see whether there's any opportunity to participate in that conversation, because you'll get, I think, much wiser feedback from that group than you would from somebody like me who has a very specific view of it, only looking at this through the lens of the free energy principle. The other thing that struck me, I noticed you were talking about oh dear, where's it gone now? You were talking about platonic attractors. Now, I've also recently been alerted to this by Mike Levin, who has just recently invited a series of it's like an asynchronous workshop, so nobody has to be there at the same time, but you record your presentation and everybody else watches it when they're available. And I think they run at the moment on Tuesday afternoon for us. I haven't seen one yet, and I haven't participated yet. But the point of this is that they are, it's called a Platonic series. And the whole, it's not Platonic attractors in and of themselves, but it's basically Platonic forms that self-organize in his spirit of sort of basal cognition, sort of, sort of, you know, getting beyond neuronal chauvinism and saying that you find this kind of structure, this Platonic form everywhere. And it strikes me, if you're bringing the notion of Platonic forms and Platonic attractors to the table to explain language as convergent evolution in large language models and in humans, that may be an interesting forum just to express that. Again, these are just talking to people who are really interested in these issues. But so if you can sort of get in there or email him, or in fact there's an organizer whose name escapes me, who might be better to approach, is to say that you've heard about this notion of Platonic forms and Platonic approaches to this from me, and have been pursuing very similar ideas in the context of language. Is there any opportunity to get access to the recordings? Could you indeed join this little work group? I think that would be a useful set of people to talk to. So that's Mike Levin's colleague, who is not Klaus Metzner. Yeah. Oh, here we are. Platonic space where. Right, thought. So this might be it here, or it might be referenced here. This paper by Mike Levin. So so perhaps you could write to Mike and say, is he pursuing this? Is he arranging workshops around this notion? And send him my best wishes if you do so. Now, yeah. So these papers are just to highlight the work that I've done in this space with Chris Frith, specifically in terms of the hermeneutics problem. That, if you're talking about language, you're talking about communication. If you're talking about communication from the point of view of inference, it's basically, I'm trying to infer what you meant. And of course, to do that, I have to align my generative models. And when they are aligned, then we have generalized synchrony and everything's working fine. So this is just a theoretical, a nod to a theoretical piece, work with Chris Frith, just linking the biophysics of entrainment and synchronization, and formally synchronization of chaos or generalized synchrony, to the inferential perspective that underwrites language, which is really sort of inferring meaning of another with whom I'm coupled. That work, why has it jumped to there? That work with Chris was more recently revisited using numerical analyses. And the only reason I'm putting this paper up is to show that language can, in principle, be an emergent property of free energy minimization or active inference, in the sense that if we share a world, but we see different parts of that world, or we see it through different eyes, if we have a common ground or a common generative model, and we develop the ability, or we learn or acquire the ability. So this is again sort of anti-Chomskyan and sort of in the sense that communication is learnable, and in fact more than that. The idea here is it's actually an emergent property. It's inevitable, simply because if we share the world and we can now come to share the same generative models, then by implication, our world models, our generative models are aligned. And as soon as they're aligned, all we need to do is to have a unitary mapping between a concept, a posterior inference, and some utterance in order now for us to communicate. And it doesn't matter what that word is. It could be, what was it, lorry versus truck. As long as there's a one-to-one mapping between my belief about this latent cause of the world, this object that has this noun, for example, and possibly an adjective, and you're looking at the same thing, and you have this posterior unlabeled latent representation. If you can articulate in a one-to-one way, I can learn that whenever I see this, I hear you saying that, and I hear myself saying that, then we can now communicate. And in so doing, I can now resolve my uncertainty or surprise because I can effectively see through your eyes, or at least I can see the products and what you see. So I can see more of the world, so I'm less surprised simply because we've been able to share. So that's that's the, if you like, the the heuristic backstory to this paper is that if we can share stuff and we can share our beliefs, our posterior beliefs explicitly through communication, then we can collectively minimize our surprise. And because that collective surprise or free energy is just the sum of all the individuals, that means that I'm also minimizing my surprise. Put it another way, if I minimize my expected free energy or my surprise with you, then our joint free energy is also being minimized. So we're just naturally all collectively minimizing our joint free energy. So that may or may not be interesting from the importance of this relational and shared perspective. What's this one? Oh, yes, I don't think you need to worry about that. But if you wanted to have an explicit active inference illustration, I can't quite remember whether they actually demonstrate any. No, they don't. Let's ignore this. It's an interesting little exercise where um, Thomas Parr and Giovanni Pizzullo got an active inference agent to tell you what it was doing. And you can do that because, of course, these active inference agents plan into the future. That's one way in which you can get deep generative models. And therefore, because they're planning the future and selecting one policy, they have intentions, and they can communicate and tell you about what they're going to do next. And Thomas simulated that, but I don't think it's relevant for our argument here. We've done that one. Well, let me just, before going to sort of the practical things, let me just one-off little hints that there you probably know this, but there is an enormous literature on noun-verb distinction and objective. So people interested in the functional anatomy of language have, from the start, from the early 1990s, have been using PET and then fMRI and then EEG and then MEG and now OPMs to look at, culminating the work of people like Friedrich Pulvermann. There's a vast literature on this and discussions on what it means. I've just put this up by my paper, but it's a review paper for the first 2 decades by my colleague Kathy Price, who has an encyclopedic understanding of this, motivated by the language impairments that you get through neuropsychology, namely, if you lesion different parts of the brain, what kind of deficits and language impairments ensue from that. And that can tell you a lot about, in conjunction with brain imaging, the selective activation of different areas by different word attributes, be they word classes, nouns, verbs, predictability. That's another big one, the hailing effect. If you haven't already done this, it might be just worthwhile just nodding to this literature, because it will substantiate a lot of the points you're making about sort of and in discussion with Robert, sort of, nouns having affordances, and in virtue of having affordances, necessarily making either explicit or implicit predictions about how I act on this object that has an affordance, as opposed to the perceptual attributes that might be encoded by adjectives that would be necessary to make to predict, but to provide empirical priors over certain attributes that, more in the temporal and indeed the occipital regions. So I put that as an example, which saves you having to use a large language model to do your literature review. Get Kathy Price to do it for you, and then you can pick out what you thought was the most interesting. This paper, it just allows me, before I go to sort of the specific examples that you might want to use to understand the predictive processing that would give rise to these things under a generative model as opposed to a transformer architecture. Just wanted to draw a bright line, which may or may not be interesting for you. There's a distinction between understanding a neural network as a state space model that is generating language or recognizing language in terms of latent states, say concepts, or of a lexical or a semantic, or indeed, having different kinds of prosody, and finding the mapping between the content or the history of the content and the next word. And in my world, this is very, very similar to understanding the functional architecture of neural networks, irrespective of their function, but just understanding the connectivity of a brain, a neural network, and being able to summarize the most likely responses of that network, just given the history of its inputs. So this is a sort of generic problem in system identification and engineering, where you bring different kinds of input-output state models to the table. And you can characterize these models in two different ways. You can characterize them in terms of, if you like, a generative model of their outputs, so the predictions of the next word. And that generative model will be written down in terms of the influences that different latent states have on each other. And that will be one characterization. And indeed, if those influences conform to the kind of message passing you'd find in a Bayesian filter, or any active inference scheme or free energy minimizing scheme, then that would be an apt understanding of the message passing and the structure of the generative model that is generating language, for example. But there's another way of being able to predict the output of any given system, which is much more of a black box approach, which is, I think, more usefully applied to large language models. And that's given the history of inputs. If the system is controllable, I can always predict the output by some nonlinear mixture of the history of the inputs. So this is a description of a mapping that goes from observable to observable, with the nuance that we're talking about a very long context window, a very deep history, as opposed to understanding the mapping from the cause to the consequence, or the latent state. So if I wanted to generate a particular sentence, I would need to know where to stimulate the large language model a suitable level, and it would generate a sentence. And it might be a sentence that is generated under constraints which are purely about the sort of the prosody and the emotionality of a particular sentence. So the words it would select by itself, or I could stimulate low down in the model and actually generate a particular word, or a short phrase at intermediate levels, again speaking to the separation of temporal scales. I can't do that with, unless I know where to stimulate, and I know the functional architecture and the influences and the implicit structure of the structure of the implicit generative model. But what I can do is just characterize completely, in the spirit of a large language model, the mapping from the history of the past inputs to the next output. And that has a really interesting maths. I don't know if you've come across this. Have you come across this in terms of Volterra kernels?
No, not in this context, but so it's funny that you mentioned this, because I'm co-supervising a master's student together with Jürgen Schmidhuber, and
All right.
they very recently introduced this concept of in-context programming. So there they did something quite similar that you suggested, namely they trained an autoregressive model to predict from a series of internal states of a large language model the next internal state or the output of the large language model. And it turns out that this works relatively good for simple tasks. However, if you prompt, so if you challenge the large language model with a challenging complex task where it has to reason, then it works very bad. So then the mismatch between the predicted next hidden state from the autoregressive model and the actual next hidden state is relatively high. And this can even be used to quantify the complexity or the hardness of a task. And they call this in context programming.
All right, that's very interesting. So putting autoregressive models at every level, which of course is completely licensed by the fact that these deep temporal models do have dynamics on transition probabilities or equations of motion at each level, usually at different temporal scales. What I was actually going for something slightly simpler, which is that there always exists a mathematical description of the mapping between the history of tokenized words and the next word via something called the Fleiss fundamental formula. And that basically can be regarded as a functional Taylor expansion to really high order. So the simplest version of this would be a first order one, and that would just be a simple autoregressive model. But you can expand that and induce what called Volterra kernels, which now say that the next output is a function of the of both the previous and the previous but one, and then the interaction between them. And then you go to the third order kernel, so it's the last three inputs, and then all the three-way interactions and all the two-way interactions. So these kernels, the first kernel would just be the simple kind of first order kernel you get in an autoregressive moving average formalism. And that's just a one-dimensional kernel. And then you move to the second dimension, you get two-dimensional kernels, and then 3 and 4 and 5. And at each point, you're increasing the context sensitivity and the conditional dependence. Well, effectively, the conditional dependence is written in terms of an autoregressive regressive model, which starts to look very much like attention heads now, that you are now weighting and contextualizing the effect of this word on the predicted word that depends upon that word and that word. So you can write that down mathematically as a Volterra kernel in accord with the Fleiss fundamental formula. And the reason I bring, and that to my mind brings a sort of interesting distinction between writing down a generative model that can infer and produce language, where you'd actually write down the message passing from between the hidden states and between the hidden states and the outputs, and a large language model, which is a mapping parameterized in terms of a mapping from the history of the inputs to the outputs through a black box, which you don't need to know because you're completely characterized. There's always a unique mathematical mapping between the parameters of the dynamics in the black box and the Volterra kernels. So if you knew the internal machinations of your transformer architecture, you could then derive the Volterra kernels. You can't go the other way, but you can certainly get from an explicit representation of the generative process, the generative model, to the Volterra kernels and the autoregressive, the generalization of an autoregressive-like process. And that point was made in the conclusion of this paper, which may or may not be interesting, just talking about different ways of moving beyond Markov processes into this sort of non-Markovian, semi-Markovian world with this deep temporal structure and different ways in which you could sort of parameterize them. The reason that might be interesting, but possibly not, is I was looking for a Wikipedia entry on the Fleiss fundamental formula, but couldn't find it. But there must be one on Volterra kernels. This is taken from one of our textbooks on analyzing time series, but just shows you the universal functional form for these high order kernels. I repeat, it's just a functional Taylor expansion, but it's very expressive, and to my mind, would provide a mathematical picture of what a large language model is, in the sense that it is somehow parameterizing these kernels in the right kind of way, through learning. So if you're interested in that, this would be do a Google on Volterra kernels. The reason I mention it is that these kernels actually themselves have a language, and they have words, and they have a Lie algebra. So you can now make a link between large language models cast in terms of um, the Fleiss fundamental formula and the implicit Volterra kernels and Lie algebras. And if you can do that, there's some interesting mathematical work linking language, natural language, to Lie algebras and the implicit set theory. I was looking for I was looking for an example. There was somebody in East Germany who was applying this not just to natural language, but also to EEG. This was many years ago, but I've forgotten who it was and I can't find it. But I did find this more recent paper in 2025, a Lie algebraic perspective on tree adjoining grammars, which they apply to natural language. And so if you had a master's student or a bright PhD student, I think there's a really interesting link between the parameterization of large language models, the Volterra kernels, the Lie algebra, and the algebra that you would apply in terms of grammars of a purely mathematical sort that may or may not be apt for certain linguistic formulations. And there will be a literature on this. It's just I didn't have time to find it. I've never read this paper. It was the closest I could find that sort of connected Lie algebras with natural language or language in general. That was yeah, just a couple of final points before the two practical things. One, you were talking about Platonic forms before, and I was just emphasizing the one Platonic attractor. Whatever this attractor is, it will have to have a separation of temporal scales. It will have to have some adiabatic approximation in there with deep structure, deep temporal structure. And in my world, that basically makes this model a member of the renormalization group. So if you're, from the point of view of a physicist, what you're talking about now is not the group theoretic approach provided by Lie algebras, but a more simple renormalization group. And you find, I would say, if I was writing the discussion part of a physics of life review paper, I would say that the cross-cutting theme that you are dealing with when dealing with either the explicit or the implicit generative models of active inference and or generative AI, then they will have a renormalizing property. There will be some scale invariance, so you get the same kind of rules and the same kind of logic re-emerging at different temporal scales, so that you have narratives that are composed of sentences, and sentences composed of words, and words composed of letters, and letters composed of phonemes, all the way down and all the way up. And this is implicit. This is, if you like, a Platonic form for the generative models that entail a particular pullback attractor or attracting set that would be necessary to understand something like language that has this sort of scale invariant deep structure. This does not deal at all with language, but it just covers a number of different. Does it? Can't quite remember now. Oh yes, it does. It covers music, which is yeah, there's some music, some jazz music here. So it doesn't deal with language, but it certainly shows how one could deploy the renormalization group, where you get this renormalizing operators operating both semantic space or lexical space and in time. That's the key thing here, which so that's just a throwaway observation that the Platonic attractors, I would imagine, have to feature this scale invariant aspect. And if you want to build a generative model that has these attracting sets as constraints on the kind of content that are generated or inferred, then you're talking about renormalizing generative models implicitly at some level. There's lots of other stuff going on, obviously, but the cross-cutting theme may well be that. The other cross-cutting theme that you may like is you seem to be quite happy at one point noting that the results in the large language models could be construed as doing some kind of inference. This paper from Chris Buckley's group, although it doesn't say so in the title, is just a demonstration that the transformer architecture that's underneath most large language models can be read as a Bayesian filter. So, you know, you can say that, should you want to, that, you know, there is a route to understanding the operations of a large language model internally in terms of evidence accumulation and belief updating, much in the spirit of you know, an extended Kalman filter or Bayesian filter. The precise details of that, of course, are a bit obscure, but at least mathematically there are ways of interpreting transformer architectures in terms of Bayesian filtering, and with a special focus on the attention, which becomes precision estimator you know, in the filtering perspective. So that was by Ryan Singh and Chris Buckley. It was in Europe, so one of those anyway. Attention marginal probability is all you need. So I thought you might like that, just as another little nod to joining the dots between the different ways of formulating and looking at the functionality that you're dealing with. So in closing, I was intrigued by your relationships between the degree of brain activation and the predictability. This was, if you like, one of the denouements of numerical analyses under predictive coding, looking specifically at the segmentation problem, detecting the phonological edges and being able to make sense of an auditory stream, very much, you know, in the spirit that Achim was talking about when doing the MEG data. And basically saying that, you know, if I've got a number of hypotheses, so it could be this word, this word, this word, or this word, this word, this word, and they imply different word boundaries. I can now put these different hypotheses to the auditory stream and use Bayesian model comparison to see which is the best fit, and in so doing define the you know, the boundaries of the phonemes, and then make the best inference, and then rinse, wash, and repeat at a higher level. But the focus on this was basically how do I do my segmentation, and how do I understand EEG and MEG signals, or in this paper LFP signals, in relation to this kind of active listening. And the fascinating thing from your perspective, of my perspective, listening to your talk, is that when you simulate belief updating, the degree of the ERF or the power of the ERF or the ERP scales in a really lawful way with the Bayesian surprise, which is just the degree of belief updating. So if something's really predictable, there's not going to be much belief updating. But if something is unexpected, then I'm going to change my mind a lot, and I can measure that with the KL divergence between the posterior and the prior, which you can call Bayesian surprise. And therefore, and that can be lawfully related to the amplitude of the ERFs under this particular model. I can't remember if there are any equations.
So sorry, can I quickly, like, was it a this was just simulated data?
This is purely simulated data.
But this means this gives a good explanation, right, for the correlation we found.
Yes.
Basically that.
No, absolutely. Yes. No. So, but don't sell it. Don't say it's a good explanation. Say that
Sorry, yeah, I understand.
this is your hypothesis. You predicted that. So go in there and say, yeah, we believe that we would find, and then you show your results. I know you've already written it up, but in a synthesis or review paper, use this kind of result to say that there are first principle lawful reasons why predictability would induce or would reduce the amplitude of my measured ERFs. You know that's true, but what I'm saying is that you can appeal to numerical studies of this sort to say, look, under the hypothesis that the brain works like this, and indeed, this particular paper was exactly addressing what you were addressing. How do I put word boundaries in place? So, I'm saying use a bit of um, poetic license to to motivate your remarkable results, in a sort of Popperian way. And I think that would empower you and I think sort of be certainly convincing from the point of view of people like me. So that was, yeah. So I thought you'd like that result because I liked your results. And that was in a paper entitled "Active Listening," with me as the first author and Emma Holmes as the final author. Well, in fact, Kathy Price, who's the author of that review of linguistic brain imaging studies. And the other thing that struck me was your talk when you were talking about the N400. I don't actually have any simulations of the N400, but I do of the P300. So this again, interestingly, was the denouement. It was the last conclusion of a numerical study of simulated brain responses to language processing under deep temporal models with this non-Markovian separation of temporal scales. And what this shows is that if you violate a single word, in this instance, it was the font in which a visual word representation was presented, you get very fast, short mismatch negativity-like effects. But if you violate the class of the word, in this instance, the semantic class that had was expected, so that surprise now is at a different level in the model. It's semantic, not sort of lexical or in this instance lexicographic, orthographic. Then the surprise now is elicited much later on, a little bit like speaking to Robert's point. To understand something that's not a verb, you need the context. This is a little bit like that. To understand that the context has been violated, where the context is established in terms of the semantics, you actually need to have slower processing that has accumulated a lot more information over time, and therefore to physically realize in the neuronal message passing that surprise, it can only occur after you've seen the entire word, and you've processed that in relation to its content and to its context. So this may or may not be useful in relation to your N400, but it might be useful in the sense that the P300 is not unrelated to the N400, and emerges very, very selectively under these deep generative models when you introduce the right kind of surprise. And then you can sort of introduce to the reader the notion of different kind of surprises and different kind of Bayesian surprises and belief updates. It could be about the lexical aspect, it could be about the semantic, it could be about the prosody, it could be about and so on and so forth. You've got multiple levels of abstraction in these deep deep models. So those results, this was visual word processing as opposed to auditory word processing under a deep generative. Where is the deep generative model? No, well, it's there somewhere. There it is. In a paper entitled Deep Temporal Models and Active Inference in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. I repeat, it, it may endorse the importance of finding N400 surprise-related responses under different kinds of violations. If you can say this is an emergent property under the hypothesis, you've got a sort of surprise minimizing inference scheme making sense of a particular stream that has this deep temporal structure, and that is it. Good, we've done everything. And I can stop sharing and stop talking now.
May I ask a question in this context? When you regard your models, do you have hypotheses which brain region this is related to?
Yeah, I mean, clearly I do, because I work with people like Kathy Price and Emma Holmes, whose job it is to understand the functional architecture and anatomy of language. So I repeat, specifically because it's very important from a clinical point of view in terms of recovery of language after stroke, but also, conceptually very interesting. However, I won't respond to that, but what you can do, should you want to, is if you've got, a digital twin, they've trained, say, one of these deep generative models or a large language model where you've been able to identify the nature of the encoding of, say, the latent causes, the attention heads in a large language model. What you can do is, instead of asking, I guess that this level of encoding is found in the prefrontal in Wernicke's area and in Broca's area, but not in sensory motor area, if it's, say, an adjective that doesn't have any affordance, for example. So you could put it the other way around. You can actually build a model, simulate the responses to the same stimuli that the subject showed, generate synthetic ERFs, and then ask, where do I find these ERFs? You can actually now say, I've got these simulated ERFs, and I've got these empirical ERFs, and now I just want to test different hypotheses about where they belong. And that would be one way of using your large language model to drive the search for the neural correlates of the processing at different levels in the language model that have an anatomical specificity because of your source reconstructed ERFs or MEG data. No one's done that to my knowledge, but it's something in principle you could actually, in a very in a principled way, you could say, no, if we associate semantic processing with these responses, at the fourth level of a neural network. And this is how they change in time in response to a visual or auditory input. Then you can just look for the correlations between that waveform, noting that, of course, the whole point of a difference between a mismatch negativity and a P300 and N400 is that they have very different shapes in time. So if you can now look for the correlates of that and find it's in the prefrontal cortex, that would be remarkable. Because then you can say that this slow processing deep in the large language model or deep in a deep generative model is most likely to occur high in the auditory hierarchy and possibly in Brodmann's area 44 or 45, as would be suggested by, as we hypothesize on the basis of, the imaging neuroscience of language production.
Yeah, thank you for this was quite overwhelming. So the sheer amount of information and details and ideas and all the papers that you mentioned. So I think we will have plenty of work to go through all these suggested papers and concepts. And thank you in particular for pointing us towards Stephen Harnett and Michael Levin. So we will definitely contact these guys. And so I have one last question, because I'm aware that we are running out of time.
Me too.
So overall, would you in principle subscribe to the idea of platonic attractors in cognition or in, let's say, cognitive systems, or would you say this is highly speculative and this is kind of beyond contemporary science?
I think I would subscribe to them, but I'm not absolutely sure what they are. So if I'll tell you in a year's time when I understand what they are, and then
Yeah.
I think I understand. If I can read a Platonic attractor as basically an attractor that has attributes that any attractor should have, in the sense of having a Platonic form, that it could be no other way ultimately, then yes, I think I would subscribe to them. But as with all new ideas, it's going to be redefined, and you're going to have arguments with people who thought it meant something else, and so it could mean something different, in a few years' time. So I'll tell you in a year's time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to, like, I love the idea of like this digital twin. If you're honest, that is a really good idea, because like we have basically at the moment, or like the main part of my research now is really on BCIs, so on EEG, and there you have a great temporal resolution, but basically no spatial resolution. And at some point, I was so overwhelmed of the information, but I really think perhaps there's a creative solution where to place it, to do nice speech decoding, to understand more, like to have a creative approach to really get one step further. I don't know how to formulate it in a proper way, but do you understand what I mean?
Yes.
Okay. So that was the idea why I asked that. But potentially it's at a point where we did not look at yet. So just always do it in the motor cortex, your implant, and then it's really bad to decode speech, for example, because it's a lot of effort and so on. And if there's some more natural placement, then we can learn perhaps something and do proper decoding. So yeah. So just as explanation. And the second question is on the organizers, like, can we enter the video at some point? Because like perhaps it would be really helpful to reconsider everything. Because I think if I have, I want to see and
we usually upload them on YouTube if you are okay with that, which I don't remember what you say about that, but yeah, that's
okay. That's fine. Great.
Cool. Thank you both for the presentation. Thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Carl, as always. I'm seeing you, Carl. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you next time.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much for
having us.
It was a pleasure. So it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.